The Delusion of Controlling Nature. And he just said that his book is on Amazon. So I hope that you find his talk a stimulus for buying his book. So thank you very much. And we can proceed now to his presentation.
Thanks, Glenda. I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for coming out or sitting in, I guess, listening this evening. It's nice to have you all here, have someone to talk to. It's not just me alone in this room. Um, yeah, so I'm not an expert on your particular part of the world, the Dyke Marsh, but I've done some digging around into it and feel that there's a lot of things that you're dealing with that I've encountered throughout my reporting in the past and in this book. So tonight, I hoping to share with you the research that I've come across, the experiences that I've had, and people I've spoken with, and hopefully some of that will ring true and offer you all some, I don't know, some perspective or some interesting things to think about and apply to your world. I'll do a presentation. I'll read a little from the book. I'll talk about what I found, and then I'll be happy to open it up for questions after that, and do my best to provide some sort of meaningful feedback to whatever it is you'd like to talk about. Um, yeah, so as Glenn said, my name is Stephen Robert Miller. I'm a freelance journalist. The book is called Over the Seawall, Tsunami, Cyclones, Drought, and the Delusion of Controlling Nature. It's published in 2023, and it's a book about solutions to the climate crisis, but not how do we solve the climate crisis, because I think we all have a pretty good handle on how to solve the climate crisis, which is to stop burning fossil fuels. But this is a book about what we do to solve the problems that are already baked into climate change. So the sea level rise and the droughts and the wildfires and the floods and the adaptations that'll make it so that we can live with those impacts and survive. I've always been interested in complex stories as a reporter, complex characters, nuanced stories that don't have simple answers to the problems that we're talking about. And I had for years reported on solutions at a magazine called Yes Magazine, which have been for decades doing kind of leftist activism and solutions journalism. Solutions journalism is real big in the journalism world now, and I think a lot of reporters set off with this idea of trying to provide useful solutions to these big, complex problems in our societies. It's a great idea, I think, but it's also, it can be very challenging. And I think it runs the risk after doing it for years and still doing it to this day, and also working as an editor, editing these stories. I learned it's easy for reporters to fall into the trap of kind of forgetting about the downsides of these things. You don't have enough words in your story to write about how the solution really doesn't apply everywhere except for this one particular community or something. And so I set off to write a book that's really about the disasters that result from failed solutions. And that's what Over the Seawall is. It's a disaster book, with climate change involved. Um, if there's one takeaway, kind of basic takeaway I would take from it, it's that, we're not going to solve the climate crisis with the same thinking that we use to cause it. And that might seem like a pretty obvious thing to say, but I tell you right now, there are people all over the world investing a ton of money, human capital, time, and energy into building solutions that look a hell of a lot like the ones that ended up in my book. And if they had worked before, I wouldn't have written about them. Um, a lot of times, these are simple solutions to complex problems, and they will have these accidentally cause harm down the road. Um, so the wonky term that comes up in my book, I try not to use it too much, but this is what academics talk about when they talk about this issue. It's called maladaptation, right? Just bad adaptation. Um, and basically, it's what happens when you impose a solution onto a system and it has these downstream impacts. Either it actually causes more harm in the same kind of harm it was trying to get rid of, or it pushes the harm onto somebody else in a different time or a different place. Um, One example that I think has become pretty common these days is air conditioning. It's a simple one, but it's a good illustrative one. We run our air conditioners when it gets hot to try to get away from the heat. Those air conditioners, as long as they're being powered by fossil fuels, then they're driving the production of fossil fuels, which of course is driving climate crisis, which is impacting the heat. And so it's this kind of loop. Another example that I deal with a lot out here west, and we're seeing more and more now these days in the east, is wildfires. Back in the Depression era, you might be aware of something that was called the 10 a.m. policy, which said that all wildfires seen off in the forest lands in the west needed to be put out by 10 a.m. the morning after they were first spotted. And so, wildfire crews were going off, putting out every blaze they could find. The result of this was that fires, forests didn't burn. And the reality is that forests adapted to burn. And when they were not allowed to burn, they grew overly dense. And years later, now that it's getting hotter and drier out west, they're not just burning a little bit in a healthy way, but they're burning these terrible conflagrations, these mega burns, mega fires that are unnatural to the system, or at least not common to the system that we're aware of. And of course, the another one is seawalls. And seawalls might, stop a wave, but they also deflect that energy because the wave energy doesn't just disappear, right? It has to go somewhere. That energy then gets deflected. It has impacts to ecosystems, it impacts to economies, to fishing economies, and to tourism economies. So these are all forms of kind of maladaptations. There's no perfect solution. There's probably no solution to these problems that's ever going to solve all of these things, right? Um, but I think the goal, at least my goal in thinking about this issue, is thinking about how do you create a solution that is going to address as many of these potential, future downfalls as possible, to create something that might last and be useful down the road, not be so short-sighted. Um, Real quickly, something that helped me get into this book. I'm in Colorado now. I was actually born in Pittsburgh, but I spent a lot of years in Tucson, Arizona, and I was always blown away by the fact that so many people were moving to the middle of the friggin' desert. Like it never made sense to me, even as a little kid when I first moved there. Um, to moving to a place where water, something as basic as water, was just a problem. Um, and when I was looking into this book, and I discovered the story of what happened on March 11, 2011, in the northeast coast of Japan, I suddenly learned, how easily people can put their faith into solutions that seem too big to fail until, of course, they do. And these are these mega solutions, these huge infrastructural projects. My dad used to watch this show called Modern Marvels in the History Channel. And my book talks about modern marvels, except that in this case, the story doesn't end with everybody, being happy and wonderful. It actually ends with terrible disasters. Um, so that said, I'm going to go ahead and share a presentation. I'm going to jump into a short reading from the beginning of the book, the section that begins in Japan, um, and we'll dive into this topic. All right, everybody see my screen, I hope. Let me know if you can't. So to set this up, this is Ishinomaki. It's a town in the northeast coast of Japan. I went there to interview people who had experienced the tsunami from 2011. And then while I was there, I heard about the story of a temple up on a hill that had sheltered hundreds of evacuees and refugees during the event. And so I went there to interview the priest, who you can see there on the right, and his wife, Miki. And that's the setup. And there we go. So by the time that I arrived in Ishinomaki, 11 years had passed since one of the most horrific catastrophes in modern history. Like most of millions of others around the globe, I had watched and rewatched hundreds of witness videos, spending hours descending down a rabbit hole of some foreign grief. I had read the news reports and the books, I had listened to recordings of survivor stories, mined the academic literature, and spoken with dozens of experts, but there was nothing that could have prepared me for what I hear and see once I get there. Now I sit cross-legged amid the earthy scent of tatami mats in the Doganin temple, drinking iced yellow tea and listening to the soft-spoken Miki tell me how the last of the survivors left in August of 2011. It's a clear, hot day in what has been an oppressively muggy summer, and I'm just happy to be getting out of the sun while her Japanese washes over me. Today I'm traveling with Sebastian Penmalenbore, who you can see here. He's a French anthropologist who studies death and grief and burial rituals. And while I take in the serenity of the temple's inner hondo, he talks with Miki and the priest about the hundreds of Buddhist ceremonies that they've held for the 19,747 confirmed victims and 2,500 others who are still recorded as missing after an 11-year absence. My eyes wander along the gilded altar, the intricately carved statues, and the hanging banners. If not for the photos of children sleeping on this very floor, bundled in the dirty winter clothes, I couldn't tell anything out of the ordinary had ever happened here. Ishinomaki lost 3,173 souls that day. That's more than any other city in Japan, but not because it was uncommonly vulnerable. The port was well developed with breakwaters out in the bay. A concrete seawall had skirted the coast. Its flat face was pockmarked from decades of abrasive tides, and it rose straight up to about 20 feet in some places. It was no match for the wave that came in 2011, but then nothing was. No country was better prepared for the tsunami than Japan, and yet its leaders later admitted to being totally caught by surprise. Tens of thousands perished, and I'm still wrapping my head around it. I'm not the only one. This disaster lured swarms of journalists, civil engineers, anthropologists, and even tourists who find stories of immense sorrow and unexpected hope. Fishermen who escaped by sailing into the wave, and daughters who were lost while searching for their parents. Forests wiped away, and towns rallying to rebuild. I found myself caught up in the story of a people harmed by the very efforts taken to protect them. Climate change is often discussed as this monolithic crush bearing down on all of us at once, but what we experience is a series of actually familiar hazards, though more intense, more frequent, and certainly more erratic than we're used to. A tsunami might not be a climate driven phenomenon, but it carries the hallmarks of one: the breadth, the severity of harm. And if Japan could fall victim to adaptations built to protect it from a hazard it has known for eons, so could we all. Along the way, I learned of a 52-year-old man who we'll call Kono-san, who was not home when the tsunami struck, but whose wife was. Of the 2,500 residents in their coastal village, she was one of only 30 who perished. Between bouts of unhinged grief, Kono worried that her death had been embarrassing. Shameful might be a better word. The Japanese have a rich vocabulary to describe shades of guilt, and as I will learn, it's impossible to understand the full complexity of a survivor's feelings. An elder in the community and the head of a respected household, Kona felt ashamed that he had not saved his wife. He worried about how it must have looked to his neighbors. He also wondered why his wife had not led the way to safety because he expected his family to set an example. Why had she remained while all around her alarms whirred and neighbors fled in panic? He blamed the seawall, and the numbers back him up. In the months after the disaster, a team of anthropologists from Oxford discovered that the death toll had actually been highest in communities where the government had recently invested heavily in coastal protections like seawalls and levees, and where people had little experience with such waves. They reasoned that in many cases, Tohoku seawalls had been maladaptive. Investment in protective infrastructure had not only stimulated settlement in areas that were known to be vulnerable to flooding, but they had imparted a false sense of security that delayed victims like Kono's wife from fleeing. Subsequent research showed that despite Japan's long relationship with tsunamis, education campaigns, and its regular evacuation drills, coastal residents were as much as 60% more likely to stay put when they lived behind a seawall that rose above the height estimated for an incoming wave. Crucially, on March 11, 2011, initial alerts reported a 9.8-foot tsunami, and many towns had already been protected by a 13-foot seawall. In Ishinomaki, the wave reached 22 feet. Miles north, residents of the Taro district of Miyako City suffered the worst of this bad adaptation. They had constructed a concrete barrier so robust that locals dubbed it the Great Wall of Japan. It was X-shaped to offer double protection. It reached 34 feet high and stretched along 1.5 miles of coastline. It was the largest seawall of its time, and in 2011, people were so confident that the strength would stop it that they stood atop recording images of the wave until the very moment that they were washed away forever. At Taro, residents had put their faith in technology developed by one of the most advanced societies on Earth. 161 victims discovered too late that their trust had been misplaced. So it struck me that in the wake of such a catastrophic failure, the city was responding by building a new wall, 14 feet taller than the last one, and yet still more than 8 feet below the height of the wave that came in 2011. Seawalls undoubtedly saved untold lives and properties in 2011, and since then, Japan has doubled down. Knowing that another tsunami is inevitable, the country has raised roads, elevated and relocated entire towns, planted coastal forests, rethought evacuation routes. But the centerpiece of reconstruction is an old idea: encasing the coast in concrete fortifications. Today, construction has nearly finished on some 400 miles of breakwaters, river levees, and seawalls as tall as 50 feet at a cost of about $255 billion. As the walls go up and the memory of Tohoku's devastation fades farther into the past, people rebuild their homes and settle on raised land in areas that were obliterated by the wave. That the new walls are so much mightier is encouraging, but I also discovered a growing sense of disillusion toward them. It manifests in heated community planning hearings, protests over the flippant use of concrete on natural coastlines, and the embarrassment that a 52-year-old man feels about his wife's final moments. I had come to Tohoku to learn what had happened, to find out, if anything, what the past decade could teach the rest of us about how or how not to adapt to this increasingly unforgiving planet. Sitting in the Doganin temple, I can picture the hundreds of people dragging themselves up the steep approach in the thick, wet snow of a distant march. When all the engineering marvels and techno wizardry and gadgets had failed them, victims of a horrific tragedy came seeking the only salvation they could think of. They went to a centuries old temple on a hill. Given the threats bearing down on all of us across the world today, the uncountable risks and inconceivable uncertainties, and the comparative frailty of our grandest inventions, I'm left thinking that sooner or later, we're all going to find religion. All right, this is another part of the fortifications. You see these concrete jacks lining the coast. And I met this fellow at one point and just trying to get inside his head and think, what is this guy going to do now, man? Um, okay. So obviously, tsunamis are not a climate driven phenomenon. But for me, the story of what happened on March 11th kind of helped me understand this big wonky issue of what I call bad adaptation, what experts call maladaptation. It's important to note that the adaptations we're talking about, they do not need to catastrophically fail. Like I said in this, that the seawalls in Tohoku did save a lot of people's lives and a lot of property, but they also caused a lot of downstream impacts and unintended consequences. That's the hallmark of maladaptation. Relating this to climate change, though, when I was there, people talked often about a phrase they use, sutegai or sotegai. And sotegai was a phrase that TEPCO, the nuclear power plant company, and the media and politicians there used over and over. Is basically a way of kind of shirking the responsibility for what had happened in 2011. Basically, in American translation, it means, beyond expectation. And the idea then, of course, is that no one could have imagined what happened, so how could they have been prepared for it? But in truth, the 2011 disaster was not unprecedented. People had been predicting it and warning about it. One of the first characters you'll meet in my book had predicted that a wave of that size, it actually happens about twice as often as every 1,000 years. In fact, he had proven that it does. And he had learned this from exploring generations of personal records that people had left behind, from ancient texts in Japan, and from studying soil samples. And that's a really big deal because if it happens every 400 years instead of every 1,000 years, we should really consider that in the way that we are developing and adapting our communities. And so Guy reminded me as a climate journalist of this phrase I come across all the time called the no analog future. No analog future basically means that baselines no longer relate, that we don't have anything to compare what's coming to. But that's not true either. The Earth has a history of changing temperatures and sea levels, and people have been adapting to it for as long as people have been around. Of course, it's never happened this fast or this intensely, maybe, but the baseline has shifted. One of the hard truths today is that what we used to think of as a worst case scenario is quickly becoming a pretty common event. And so, of course, we need to plan predictably, accordingly, rather. Okay, so in this book, I traveled from Denver, where I live, or north of Denver, to Japan, particularly this northeast coast. You can see some of the highlights there up in the Sendai area. Then to Bangladesh, the second part of my book, particularly the southwest portion of the country, and then finally back to where I spent most of my life in southern Arizona. In each case, I investigated the failure of these massive technological solutions, seawalls, levees, dams, and canals, trying to understand what had gone wrong. I focus a lot, not just on the infrastructure, but on the systems behind the infrastructure, the politics, the culture, the economics. And despite these places seeming totally different, there's a lot of similarities. One of them, when I was reporting in Japan, I kept coming across, being afraid of being rude to people, asking them to relive what was without a doubt the worst moment of their entire lives. And they probably talked about it countless times to reporters. But what I kept coming across were people who felt that it would be worse to forget than to remember. In 2011, seawalls had delayed the evacuation, and 60% more likely, people were 60% more likely to ignore evacuation orders if they lived behind a large seawall. The seawalls had created this false sense of security, and that really rang true to me from someone who grew up in the desert. After 2011, the Japanese government had doubled down with plans to build bigger walls and had sent experts to these communities with complex explanations and high-tech models of these designs to try to assure everybody that the next wall would work this time, that it would actually stop whatever wave was going to come. But survivors were afraid that the new infrastructure would only erase the past lessons and cause people to be apathetic. In Arizona, for hundreds of years, or for 800 years, white settlers have made more and more ambitious attempts to secure water in the middle of the desert, from damming local rivers to tapping in the groundwater, then piping in even distant rivers and crazier things they're considering now. I spent a lot of my time with farmers who had become completely dependent on the Colorado River through a project called the Central Arizona Project Canal. And you can see this in the Phoenix area back in '89. You can see how the sprawl has happened. The farms have dried up. 2009, of course, the situation looks even more different. I should have a more recent image on this. But these farmers have become dependent on the Colorado River Canal because of the CAP project, the Central Arizona Project. When it was finished in the 1980s, it was one of the largest public works projects ever in the US, a true modern marvel. And it seemed to have made it totally hospitable for mass agriculture and massive cities in the middle of the desert. But here we are just 50 years later, and the water is already drying up. In this image, you can see that line going around is the project. You can see where it comes off the Colorado River next to California and rides its way down to Tucson. So I won't dwell on this too much. I'd be happy to answer more questions about it, but it's a long ways from Dyke Marsh. But kind of the short story on this is I spent a lot of my time in this part of the world talking to farmers. This one, here's one of them, Jace Miller, no relation to me, but he's a young guy in his mid 30s who's invested his entire life, his education, his family, everything into this. Into his farm, a fifth generation farm in the middle of the desert that grows mostly hay and alfalfa. And he is one of the farmers who has become completely dependent on the Cap Canal from the Colorado River, and because of climate change, is now among the first farmers to be kicked off of it. So farmers here have become overly dependent on this rigid infrastructure supported by rigid legal policy, unchanging legal policy in the Colorado River Compact. And now they're finding that the environment they live in, it actually changes quite often. But they're too committed to move on. And what are they going to do next? Where are they going to go? The area now is seriously considering massive desalination down in Mexico and piping that water north. They've considered floating icebergs from Alaska down the coast and taking the water somehow from California into Arizona. They've considered piping water from the Mississippi River out to Arizona. They considered piping water from the Columbia River out to Arizona. All of these things might seem crazy, but at one time the Cap Canal was considered to be a harebrained idea, and yet it was built. The book talks to a lot of people like Jason and makes an attempt to kind of share those personal stories beyond kind of the infrastructure and the science stuff. So the next stop in the book, and I think one that really might make sense for you all, is Bangladesh. For me, this was without a doubt the most difficult place to report and area to understand. Unlike the event that happened in Japan, the single-day tsunami, the disaster unfolding in Bangladesh has been going on for centuries. It's a story of colonialism and corruption, the modern global foreign aid system. The U.S., well, at least it used to spend about $35 billion on foreign development. I think that number is drastically reduced now. But even then, less than 10% of that money made it to projects on the ground. Most of that money went to designers and American consultants, the Beltway bandits, they call them, while people on the ground were kind of left out to dry or to fund things on their own. That plays a big role in what gets built here and how the adaptation, plays out. But mostly, the story that I discovered in Bangladesh is a story about rivers, about what happens when we underestimate rivers and how, if we're not careful, our adaptation to climate change along rivers will fall prey to the same forms of economic and political exploitation that have caused climate change. So in a nutshell, Bangladesh is a very small but very populous country located on a flat delta floodplain that's crisscrossed by some 400 rivers. The estimates on the number of rivers change all the time because the rivers are changing all the time because the river is running through mud. So the mud is always moving around with the water. People have lived there for thousands of years. With the Europeans in the 17th century, with the Dutch East Indies Company came to the region and really drastically modified the landscape. Go back to this map. One of the biggest changes that they made, and this might make sense to you all, down in this region of the country, especially, they clear cut. They clear cut the delta, get rid of most of the mangrove trees that were growing there in an attempt to create farmland so they could grow jute and rice and tea and things that they could then send back to the factories and processing plants in Great Britain. Once they had created the farmland by clear cutting the trees, they needed something to protect that farmland from the constant flooding of all these rivers that come out of there. The region has a monsoon season that causes floods when the water comes pouring out of the Himalaya, and it has a season of flooding that comes up from the Bay of Bengal when cyclones rush in and flood that way. And so locals had kind of, people native to the region had learned how to deal with these things, but the incoming Westerners were not so keen on it. They created what they called polders. Polder is a Dutch word, speaking of Dutch words, um, that is essentially a man-made island. Here's a kind of one example. You can see the earthen levee or an embankment that's been raised. On the right side, you have entrance into a river that's draining into the Bay of Bengal. On the left side, you have what's probably a shrimp farm. And you can see off in the distance some trees. There are hundreds of these polders all over the Southwest region. They were not there before the Europeans got there and built them. Um, and if you know anything about a river system, you know that rivers carry more than just water. So this adaptation that the Dutch and the English had then really pushed in order to solve this problem of rivers flooding their banks and flooding farmland had completely ignored the reality of the natural sediment that comes along the Ganges River Delta system. The Ganges River system is one of the largest river systems in the world. It carries about 1 billion metric tons of natural sediment to the Bay of Bengal every single year. If that sediment does not build up, it gets spread across the delta, which is why the delta is there, because the sediment has spilled out of the Himalayas and spread across the flat delta plain. If that sediment is not allowed to spread across the plain, if it's contained within the rivers because of the embankments that have been built to create the polders, then where does that sediment go? It builds up inside the rivers, which means the height of the water then rises, and it means when there are floods upstream or when the cyclones push the water from the Bengal the seaward side up into the land, you have more and more flooding, causing untold deaths. Actually, untold is right because it's been getting harder and harder to know the real number of deaths in this region. It always was, but they're very poorly monitored for reasons that might be obvious. This is an example of how these embankments, these levees, are made today. Still to this day, these people are doing this pretty much constantly. This land is always in flux. These rivers, pushing. Imagine if you just shoot a water hose in your garden through mud or through soft clay or something, the way that the dirt will move around and cause new rivulets and new channels to open. That's what happens here. And so these things, they get pushed down. People have to go out and rebuild them. They get paid very little to do this work. It's backbreaking. It's extremely hot and miserable. But if they don't do it, there's nothing to protect them and their families and their farmlands and their shrimp farms from the encroaching tide. You can see at the top of that picture, there are some stuffs. You can see trees sitting out on the right side of the river, of the embankment, which is actually where the river would be. In many cases, I would talk to people standing on the embankment and looking out, and you would see telephone poles or trees at the tops of houses way off in the distance under the water line. And you realize they had built these embankments. One person told me he must have built the embankment rebuilt the embankment 5 times in his lifetime, always moving further inland. It's constant work. Sometimes what ends up happening then, folks who lose their land as the embankments break and the rivers flood into the land, the embankments are public land, and so people will build their homes on the outside of the embankments. You can see this gentleman with his family. He's built his home up on the embankment, and his home is basically in the river at this point. It is highly unlikely that place will be there for very much longer. So Bangladesh is often seen as this dystopian, potential future under climate change, but I've interviewed plenty of people, top scientists, who are confident that much of the regions, particularly down in the southwest corner, could stay above the encroaching sea level rise if the natural sedimentation was allowed to play out as it always had. Unfortunately, the answer to the problem caused by the polders, just like it was in Japan and in Arizona, is of course to build even higher levees and to dredge the rivers more often. You'll see this if you're ever in that region. You'll see this constantly. These barges floating up and down the river, just spewing gray mud out of the river and onto the land side as they desperately try to keep ahead of the sedimentation. Um, but the dredging is another solution to the problem that has its own problems. It has destroyed natural ecosystems. It has put endemic species of dolphin and fish on the brink of collapse. This, of course, are things that people depend on for survival there, for both to feed their families and to make money. Um, it's all these downstream impacts. So something to consider, I guess. When I was there, I found myself always coming across this question, of who are we adapting for? When we think about climate adaptation, who is it that we are adapting for? Are we adapting for ourselves today? Are we adapting for our businesses today? Or are we really adapting for the next generation of people who are going to have to live here? When I started writing this book, I found out about partway through that I was going to have my first kid, my first son, who was born the week that I was finishing the copy edits on this book. Um, I used to be very angry about a lot of this stuff, and having him at first made me even angrier. But then I realized that anger, the anger is only so valuable. Um, you have to believe that there's a way out of this mess, and I think you have to believe that we can make choices that don't lead further generations to make worse and worse decisions, because that's what this does. Maladaptation to climate change saddles further generations to making worse and worse decisions, or choosing between worse and worse options. Hard gray infrastructure comes with enormous costs. It's good for the people who make and pour the concrete, the rebar, who dredge the rivers. Politicians love it. It drives the global aid industry, but seawalls and levees and dams and canals will need to be updated in perpetuity, long after the projects are completed and the budgets have been spent. Crucially, in Bangladesh, the World Bank is known for funding these enormous projects, but they do not fund the maintenance for these projects after they've been completed, which leaves locals high and dry once once the World Bank moves on to the next thing. Rising seas and bigger storms are going to increase the impact and drive the need for more costs. In Japan, a very old, aging country, that means that the younger tax base really gets saddled with the cost of dealing with these things, get left with the bill. In Bangladesh, it's this next generation of young people who already have few options in an incredibly overpopulated country, or I should say, highly populated country. Um, in Arizona, we keep building this infrastructure and industries that lure people. We have tax subsidies to lure businesses to a place like data centers and computer chip manufacturers, luring people to a place that will only get more comfortable and more expensive to live in. We've already guaranteed that our kids will inherit a hotter and more tempestuous planet, and I think now we need to decide that we're going to give them the tools to leave. We need to leave them with the right tools to deal with that. So, undoubtedly, people ask with this book, I talk a lot about solutions that haven't worked out. Well, what is the solution? What can they do? This all sounds like quite the bummer. Um, I make an attempt really to not champion a ton of solutions in this book, and the reason is, again, my goal here is not to tell people what to do, but to show them some things in the past, to kind of show like a roadmap and a way of for how to think about this stuff, to make better decisions. But there are, of course, solutions that have come across along the way. And I think one that is interesting to me comes out of Bangladesh. This guy, Jahim Shams, is a young fellow in Bangladesh in the southwest corner. His father had been an activist that had fought vehemently against the construction of these embankments. It's worth noting that these embankments are not just, you know, bad for the view or something. I mean, people have fought over them and died fighting over them. I've interviewed people who were involved in literal gunfights over the construction of these embankments because locals don't want them. Locals find that they damage the ecosystem, they damage their livelihood, they make it incredibly difficult to live in a place, and they actually do have ways of surviving without them. But once this infrastructure takes root, it's very hard to get rid of it and to move on and do anything different. Um, so Jean Shams has been working on a way to kind of promote a way of living with the rivers rather than trying to contain them. And that all sounds very gooey and kumbaya, but there's truth to it, as there is all over the world I've come across. And he showed me how local rice farmers, which is mostly what's grown there, had come to modify what was an ancient practice, really, of undoing the damage that the embankments have done. And when he's asking for money from Western investors, he'll say that it's an indigenous knowledge or something. But in reality, it is ideas that have been around for a long time that have been, more recently updated and revamped, and in a lot of ways improved. And that's the nature of good adaptation, right? Is that it's constantly adapting. The worst thing you can do is put something that can't be altered down the road into place. So this is called tidal river management. And you can see from this is, the blue is obviously there's a rivers heading out into the delta. The delta would be down to the right hand corner. And they're coming from the north. And you can see how all these rivers feed into the larger systems. And this just goes on and on and on. Not obviously real color. The green is vegetation. The red is either farmland or urban development. But you can see how complex these things are and how many hundreds of miles is needed of embankments to contain these places into the polders. But the idea that he is pushing is called tidal river management. And it's the idea is rather to build a tall permanent embankment out of concrete or something, but to make these small earthen embankments called bunds that will only exist in the region for a certain number of months out of the year. Basically, what they do is they let the polders and the land flood during the monsoons, which is they allow the water to flood the system to bring sediment, which is rich in nutrients, into the region during the monsoon season, and then they put up their temporary bunds to block the floods that then come from the like cyclones, the tidal surges that come later in the season that bring salt water into the regions that destroys their crops. Um, it's a yeah, if it works correctly, and they've been able to do it in some instances. I'll show you an illustration here to give us an idea. Okay, so it's kind of like a lung, and I think Shahim Shams explained this to me as kind of being the lungs of the river. Um, Down to the bottom, to the south, you could say would be the Bay of Bengal. The north is going to be the Himalaya, and so you have the tide from the Bay of Bengal pushing against this, and that's a crucial part of the story. The tidal river basin it's a basin built off to the side of the river. What happens is water flushes out of the system carrying its sediment. That sediment goes down into the Bay of Bengal. As the tide rises, the river, it pulls that water, sediment laden water, actually back out of the Bay of Bengal, back upriver. They put this cross dam over the river at a certain place with a canal then that leads to the tidal river management basin. It causes that sediment heavy water to rush into the basin, fill it up. At high tide, the highest point of tide, right, at peak tide, what happens is the water gets into a standstill. And just like sugar that's been dissolving in a glass, the undissolved sugar will settle. So the idea here is that undissolved, that sediment will settle out of the water into the TRM basin and start to gradually fill it up. The water then will pull itself back out with the tide back into the Bay of Bengal. And if you know about hydrodynamics, the water as on its way out actually goes at a faster rate and will naturally dredge the river out. Over time, the TRM basin will fill up with sediment until this basin, will become rich land that can be farmed on. The next step would be to close off the canal, move the cross dam down, and build a new TRM basin at another point and allow it to fill up. It's a pretty hunky-dory system. It sounds wonderful. It's got a lot of really wonderful things about it, but it doesn't work everywhere. It's very specific to Southwest Bangladesh, and that's a really crucial part I have found of avoiding maladaptation to climate change. These solutions are not one size fits all. There is no silver bullet. They literally make sense for certain places geographically, for certain climates, and for certain people. A challenge for even this, all the things that work incredibly well for this program. One thing that's very difficult, right, as you can probably imagine, is getting farmers to up and leave this whole area to be able to create this TRM basin. You have to pay the people. Some people are willing to do it if they get paid, but that means then you have to get the government to actually make the payments. And that has been a problem for this program moving forward. Nothing's perfect, but I think it's a pretty interesting idea. And to me, it really shows how there are solutions, but they have to be long term. They have to be pliable, and they have to really make sense for the specific location in that specific context. Um, so I like to kind of end on that, just because there is some possibility in an otherwise what might seem like an otherwise kind of dark route. But it looks like that's about the time that I've got for it. So I'd be happy to take all of your questions if anything has come to mind.
Please feel free to either put your questions in the chat or to raise your hand and I'll call on you.